Morning spills gold across the terraces of Machu Picchu, and Amaya Quispe moves through the familiar paths like a dancer tracing long memorized steps. The first tour group of the day clusters behind her. Germans, Americans, maybe a few Argentinians, cameras already raised, eager faces angled toward the iconic postcard vista where stone temples frame the jagged peak of Huayna Picchu. She gestures toward the agricultural terraces cascading down the mountainside, her voice practiced and smooth, reciting the state-approved script about Incan engineering and historical significance. But even as her mouth forms the words advanced drainage systems and astronomical alignment, her mind translates each fact into something older, something alive. She sees her grandmother's hands pressing seeds into earth. She hears the voice of the mountain wind, whispering stories that no government pamphlet will ever capture. This citadel is not a monument. It is a living grandmother, breathing beneath the feet of strangers who pose for selfies against her stones. Instead, she thinks of her own grandmother's stories, of how the stone remembers every solstice, every prayer, every hand that touched it before the Spanish came, before the archaeologists came, before the tour buses carved their groaning path up the mountain. Her ancestors didn't discover this place. They never left. They are here, in the mist that clings to the peaks each dawn, in the way the light falls just so across the Temple of the Three Windows, in the silent presence that watches every tourist snap another identical photograph. And Amaya is the only translator who remains, the only bridge between the citadel's truth and the world's appetite for consumable wonder. She poses them for the classic shot. 12 people lined up along the terraces, arms spread wide, grins fixed, and feels the weight of her own complicity settle heavier on her shoulders. Click, click, click. She is selling her grandmother's bones, one photograph at a time. Amaya counts crumpled bills in her lap, souls and dollars mixed together, tips folded into her pocket throughout the morning. It's enough for the electric bill. Maybe enough for her brother's textbooks if she skips buying new shoes again. The money smells like foreign cologne and sunscreen. She stares out the window at the encroaching sprawl. Souvenir stalls, selling mass-produced artisan textiles, construction sites where new hotels rise like concrete scars against the green hillsides, billboards advertising luxury train packages and adventure tourism. The valley that cradled her ancestors is being swallowed by an economy that sees Machu Picchu not as a sacred site, but as a product, a brand, a backdrop for influencer content. She closes her eyes and sees the same vision that haunts her every descent. Tourists flooding the citadel until the stones crack beneath their weight. Her village relocated to make room for parking lots. Her nephew speaking only Spanish and English, the old language of Quechua dying with her generation. But then she opens her palm and counts the bills again. This is survival. Her family depends on the tourists she resents, on the commodification she abhors. They eat because strangers pay to stand where her ancestors prayed. They keep the house because she plays the role of friendly native guide, smiling and patient, translating the sacred into the digestible. The contradiction sits like a stone in her chest. To protect her people, she must participate in the very system that erases them. Or is this slow dissolution the only path forward? Their mother tends the stove, her movements economical and familiar, while the television in the corner blares a national news program. Another story about tourism quotas, foreign investment, governmental control of Machu Picchu access. Inti gestures at the screen with his fork, passionate as always, words tumbling out faster than Amaya can track after a long day on the mountain. We need to control the narrative, he's saying, eyes bright with conviction. Media, science, technology, these are tools, Amaya. Tools we can use to tell our own stories, to claim power for Peru instead of letting foreigners define us. But all she can think about is the rumor she heard at the depot this morning. Talk of relocating families from the village to make way for expanded tourist facilities. Talk of land rights being quietly dissolved. Talk of her community scattered like seeds on barren ground. Tools can cut both ways, she says quietly, not meeting his eyes. What happens when they use our own technology to erase us faster? She believes in something older, quieter, in the unbroken thread of memory, in the mountains that remember everything, in the danger of translating the sacred into content. The television drones on about quotas and restrictions. Her mother serves more food in silence. And Amaya feels the familiar ache of being pulled in too many directions at once, trying to honor the past while surviving the present, trying to find a path that doesn't demand she choose between her people's spirit and their survival. He is brave in ways she cannot be. He believes change is possible without unbearable loss. She wants to protect that faith, even as her own crumbles a little more with every tour, every bill counted, every stone worn smooth by careless hands. The shrine is modest, a cairn of stones below the citadel's southern flank, overlooked by tourists and tour operators alike, tended only by the few families who remember what it means to ask permission before entering sacred space. She lights a candle with stiff fingers, the flame guttering in the wind before catching hold. Mist curls around the peaks above, turning the ruins into something half real, half dream. She presses her forehead to the worn stone at the cairn's base, feeling the cold seep into her skin, and begins to pray in Quechua, the language her grandmother taught her, the language fewer and fewer people speak with each passing year. She prays for guidance, for strength, for a path that doesn't demand she betray everything she loves in order to survive. The candle flame dances, casting wild shadows across the stones, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, she feels it. The presence she has always sensed but never named, the awareness that permeates Machu Picchu like roots beneath soil. The citadel is listening. It has always been listening. And she is not just a tour guide performing for strangers. She is a mediator, a translator, a bridge between the world that sees stones and the world that sees ancestors. For now, she kneels in the gathering dark, murmuring prayers her grandmother taught her, while the mountains hold their ancient silence and the first stars prick through the deepening sky. The Intihuatana stone blazes with inner light, and the terraces flicker and fold, becoming constellations, becoming pathways between worlds. Amaya is there, will be there, standing at the stone and chanting in desperation, words pouring from her throat in a language older than Quechua, older than memory. Time stutters and fractures. She sees children running across the terraces, laughing, then gone. She sees the river flowing backward, stones lifting themselves into new configurations, futures splitting and overlapping like shuffled cards. Multiple possibilities exist at once. The citadel preserved, the citadel destroyed, her people thriving, her people vanished, the mountains silent, the mountains singing. She reaches for the stone, and the vision releases her as abruptly as it came. The present reasserts itself. Dusk, cold, mist, the distant sound of buses groaning down the mountain road. She is shaking. The candle has gone out, and she knows, with a certainty that transcends logic, that what she just saw was not imagination. It was a warning, a promise, a glimpse of the cosmic stakes hidden beneath the surface of her ordinary life as a guide. She will lead them along the same paths, reciting the same facts, smiling the same smile. For now, the vision fades back into the place where mountains keep their secrets. And Amaya walks home through the thickening dark, carrying the weight of futures she cannot yet name, while the stars wheel overhead in their ancient uncaring dance. Amaya watches them disappear down the stone steps toward the buses, their phones still raised to capture one last photograph, one final proof that they stood here. She waits, counting heartbeats, listening to the crackle of her radio as security coordinates the evening sweep. When the voices grow distant enough, when the fog thickens into something that feels less like weather and more like privacy, she moves toward the Sun Temple with practiced quiet. Her feet know these paths better than her conscious mind. Every uneven stone, every place where water pools after rain, every shadow that deepens when tourists aren't watching. She reaches into her bag for the small bundle of coca leaves her grandmother prepared before she died, the fabric wrapping soft and worn from years of ritual use. The sacred rock at the temple's heart is cool beneath her palm, its surface polished by countless hands, and she places the leaves with the kind of reverence that has become second nature, whispering the old prayers that feel more real than any script she recites for strangers. A shimmer like wet stone catching light, a distortion in the fog that shouldn't be there. Amaya freezes, her hand still pressed to the rock, her breath caught in her throat. The shimmer detaches from the temple wall, peeling away from the stonework like a reflection separating from its source, and the shape that emerges is both solid and not, present and flickering, a form that her eyes struggle to hold in focus. It appears humanoid, tall, angular, its surface textured like weathered granite, shot through with veins of something luminous and broken. Wounded. The word surfaces in her mind before she can stop it. This being, whatever it is hurt. Amaya's heart slams against her ribs, her training screaming at her to run, to radio for help, to do anything but stand here communing with something that shouldn't exist. But her grandmother's voice surfaces through the panic. An old story about the stones that walked, about guardians who wore the mountain's flesh. The being moves closer, its form flickering more violently now, and she sees the damage clearly, fissures of dark energy splintering through its luminous core, places where its coherence is failing. "My name was Keshu," it says, and the word carries weight like a stone dropped into deep water. "I once collaborated with those you would call the Anunnaki. I helped them build this place, this branching archive of human timelines. And now the archive is failing. But the other part, the part that carries her grandmother's stories like blood carries oxygen, knows with bone-deep certainty that what she's witnessing is true. Machu Picchu is not just a ruin. It never was. The stones remember. The terraces hold more than water, and she has just been acknowledged by something that exists on a scale she cannot begin to comprehend. Keshu's form flickers more urgently, as if the effort of manifesting is draining what little strength it has left. "You will," it says, "if you choose." Distant voices crackle through the static, colleagues coordinating the lockdown, counting visitors, confirming that all tourists are accounted for. If they find her here, talking to an impossible being made of wounded light and stone, what would they think? What would they do? The memories surface without mercy. Her uncle, labeled as mentally unstable when he claimed to hear the mountains speaking, driven out of his tour guide position and left to scrape by on odd jobs. Her cousin, dismissed as superstitious when she tried to prevent construction crews from breaking ground on a sacred site. Her reputation destroyed so thoroughly that no hotel would hire her. And beneath those specific fears lies the larger threat, the one that keeps her awake at night, the relocation rumors, the government's hunger for more tourist infrastructure, the unstable legal ground her entire village stands on. If she's caught here, if she's branded as delusional or difficult, it won't just be her livelihood at risk. It could give authorities the excuse they need to displace her family, to declare the area unsafe due to unstable locals, to finally sweep away the inconvenient indigenous presence that complicates their tourism development plans. Keshu's form flickers in and out of visibility, and Amaya realizes with a spike of panic that it's fading, that whatever brought it into her perceptible reality is failing. Part of her, the frightened, practical part, wants to let it go, to back away and pretend this never happened, to return to the small, manageable world where her only responsibilities are shepherding tourists and counting tips. But even as she thinks it, she knows the truth. It's already too late. She has been seen. She has been named as one who remembers, and walking away now won't erase that recognition or the knowledge that Machu Picchu is infinitely more than she was taught to believe. Then choose. She sees the valley below, not as it is, but as it could be. The same geography splitting and replicating into divergent futures that coexist in impossible simultaneity. In one vision branch, her village thrives. Solar panels gleam on rooftops alongside traditional thatch. Tourists walk carefully marked paths, their fees funding schools and clinics. Their presence managed by indigenous-led cooperatives that maintain strict quotas and seasonal closures. Children run through the streets speaking Quechua and Spanish with equal fluency, their education honoring both worlds. The terraces attended, the sacred sites protected, and the balance holds. Imperfect, negotiated daily, but holding. Hotels rise like concrete fortresses, their foundations destabilizing ancient irrigation systems. Roads crack and buckle. She sees houses, her house, Inti's house, her neighbors' homes, swallowed by mud as a mountainside gives way under the weight of development it was never meant to carry. Sirens wail, emergency lights strobe through smoke and dust. And the people, her people, are being loaded onto buses, relocated to government housing in cities, where they will forget the old language, the old ways, the old stories, where they will become urban poor with no land, no heritage, no anchor to hold them steady in the world. And Amaya understands with sudden, terrible clarity that these aren't predictions. They're archived potentials, recorded possibilities that respond and shift based on the choices people make. Every decision is a fork in the river of light. Every action ripples forward into consequences that have been mapped, preserved, and made accessible to those who know how to see. Machu Picchu doesn't just record history, it records futures. Plural, branching, alive with terrible potential. Then the vision flips to the fractured branch, and she sees sirens wailing through smoke, sees her nephew's face streaked with tears as he's herded onto a bus, sees the moment when connection to place severs and something essential dies in his eyes. Keshu's form hovers nearby, barely visible now, its light guttering like a candle in its final moments. The temple is just a temple again. Cold stone, thick mist, the distant sound of security radios crackling through the silence. But Amaya knows what she saw, knows it was real, knows that walking away would be a choice with consequences that ripple through every possible future. Her mind races through the calculations she's made 1,000 times. Keep your head down, don't make waves, protect what you have by not risking anything. But that calculus is based on a world she no longer inhabits. She has seen the archive, she has witnessed the branching futures, and she knows with sudden, crushing certainty that inaction isn't safety. It's surrender to whatever outcome the strongest currents push toward. The relocation threats, the encroaching development, the slow erosion of her people's connection to this place, these aren't inevitable. They're one branch among many. And if she walks away now, if she chooses the comfort of willful ignorance, which future will she be allowing to take root? She thinks of her grandmother's stories about the mountains remembering, about the responsibility that comes with being able to hear what others dismiss. She thinks of the children in both visions, saved or lost, rooted or scattered, determined by choices not yet made. And she feels something shift in her chest, a letting go of the fantasy that she could ever find a path that doesn't demand sacrifice, that doesn't require her to step into danger and uncertainty. "How do I help you?" she asks, her voice steadier than she expected. Keshu's form brightens fractionally, as if her question has given it a measure of strength. "Hide me," it says, "protect me while I heal, and learn to open the archive deliberately. You have the gift, it runs in your bloodline, though the practice has been nearly forgotten." The words settle over her like a cloak. Not comfort, but purpose. Responsibility. The thing she's been seeking without knowing it. A way to be a guardian that doesn't feel like betrayal. Keshu is barely corporeal now, its form so faint she can hardly distinguish it from the fog, but she guides it with whispered instructions toward the abandoned guardhouse that sits off the main tourist circuit, half swallowed by vegetation and officially slated for demolition that never quite happens. The door groans open under her hand, the interior smelling of rot and animal nests and the particular loneliness of human spaces reclaimed by wilderness. She lays out the blankets she carried in her pack, arranges the offerings she's been saving for the next major ritual: candles, woven cloth, a small bundle of herbs her mother grows in the garden. Keshu's form settles into the space, its light dimming to almost nothing, and Amaya feels the weight of what she's done settle over her like stone. And yet, as she kneels in the darkness with the smell of coca and candle smoke rising around her, she feels more aligned with her true purpose than she has in years. Cross the threshold with intention. The notes rise thin and clear in the darkness, and she layers the chant over it, the Quechua words rolling off her tongue like water over stone. A prayer, a request, a formal announcement of intention to the consciousness that inhabits this place. Or rather, it's still there but rendered transparent, a ghost outline laid over the true structure beneath. The archive, vast and shimmering and mapped with branching rivers of light that pulse with information too dense to comprehend. She sees timelines splitting and converging, sees the weight of choices rendered visible, sees the living intelligence of the system that records and preserves and offers guidance to those who remember how to ask. She has crossed the threshold. There is no going back. And as Keshu's form brightens in response to her success, as the archive opens its terrible, beautiful knowledge to her perception, Amaya understands that she has just stepped fully into a hidden world that has always existed beneath the surface of her ordinary life. She is no longer just a tour guide. She's a mediator, a timekeeper, a guardian of futures that hang in precarious balance, waiting for human choices to tip them toward preservation or collapse. The guardhouse becomes Amaya's secret classroom, the space where daylight logic dissolves into something stranger and more demanding. Keshu's form has stabilized somewhat, its luminescence less erratic, though the damage still shows in the dark fissures that web through its body like cracks in ancient pottery. It instructs her with patience that feels almost alien in its completeness, correcting the subtle modulations in her voice as she practices the Quechua chants her grandmother taught her, revealing that what she learned as prayer is actually a precise sonic technology. Each syllable must land exactly right, not just the meaning but the pitch, the duration, the space between sounds. When she gets it wrong, the stones remain inert, ordinary. When she gets it right, light ripples across their surface in concentric rings that pulse with information she's only beginning to understand how to read. She draws breath, centers herself the way her grandfather taught her before playing the flute, and begins the chant. The first syllable comes out clean, resonating in her chest and throat. The stone responds immediately, a single ring of golden light spreading from its center like a drop hitting water. She holds the note, lets it fade naturally, then moves to the second syllable. Another ring, this one slightly wider, overlapping the first. Keshu makes a sound, like grinding gravel that she's learned means approval. She continues through the sequence, each sound triggering its own ring of light, until the stone surface is covered in overlapping patterns that remind her of tree rings or radio waves made visible. She begins to play the melody her grandfather called the Pathway Song, and as the notes rise into the musty air of the guardhouse, the rings of light on the stone begin to rotate, to reorganize themselves into new configurations. Each note shifts the pattern, brings different rings to the foreground while others recede. And within the rings she begins to see images, brief, flickering glimpses of the futures those particular sound combinations access. A ring glowing red shows her drought, failed crops, migration. A ring pulsing blue shows her cooperation, shared resources, adaptation. She's learning to read the archive's language, to understand that each ring corresponds to a cluster of related futures branching from specific choices. Picchu tries to explain in terms she can grasp. The archive records quantum states, probability waves, potentials that exist in superposition until observation collapses them into single outcomes. But even as it speaks, Amaya knows she doesn't need to fully understand the mechanics. She just needs to learn the practice, to develop the skill that will let her navigate the branching paths with enough precision to guide the archive toward stable configurations. She's not a physicist, she's a weaver, working with threads of possibility instead of wool. By the time she reaches home, she has just enough time to shower, change into her uniform, and become the person the tourists expect. Friendly, informative, safe. She poses them for photographs at the Guardian's house, explains the function of agricultural terraces, points out the Temple of the Condor with its carved wings spreading beneath ground level. Her voice recites the approved script with automatic precision, while her mind drifts elsewhere, cataloguing which stones she needs to study next, which sound sequences she should practice, which futures she glimpsed in the rings last night that demand closer attention. A woman from Chicago asks her to take a photo, and Amaya smiles and frames the shot and hands the phone back while simultaneously remembering the vision she saw 3 hours ago of this same valley consumed by fire, smoke rising black against an orange sky that suggested climate collapse taken to its logical extreme. Here, in the daylight, she's a service worker in the tourism economy, dependent on tips and positive reviews, careful never to say anything that might be construed as political or challenging. She explains Incan agricultural innovation and astronomical knowledge in terms that make it all sound safely historical, long dead, no threat to anyone's comfort. But at night, in the guardhouse with Picchu and the archive open before her, she's something else entirely. An apprentice timeline editor, learning to navigate futures with stakes so vast they make her daytime concerns feel like children's games. The contrast is dizzying. How can she smile for selfies when she knows the terraces beneath those tourists' feet are actively failing, the archive's damage bleeding into reality in ways that will soon be impossible to hide? She finishes a tour and watches the group shuffle toward the buses, already pulling out their phones to check messages and upload photos. As they disappear down the path, she slips toward a section of the site where restoration work has been stalled for months, where the public rarely ventures. A particular stone here calls to her. She's been feeling it for days, a pull she can't quite name. When she's certain no one is watching, she kneels and presses her palm against its cold surface, hums the lowest note of the chant sequence Picchu taught her. The stone warms beneath her hand, and a single ring pulses to life, showing her a branch she hasn't seen before. This site transformed into a militarized zone, access restricted entirely, local populations barred by armed guards. The vision makes her stomach clench. Another possible future, another path the present moment could branch toward. She files the knowledge away, releases the stone, and returns to her ordinary persona just as her radio crackles with instructions for the next tour group. At dinner, Inti talks about his latest blog post, the attention it's getting from international indigenous rights networks. Her mother mentions a neighbor's granddaughter who's studying in Lima, leaving the village for opportunities in the city. Amaya nods and responds in appropriate places, but part of her is already gone, already planning the night's training session, already hearing Picchu's instructions echoing in her mind. She's become expert at performing presence while being fundamentally elsewhere. Emir sees the posts while scrolling on her lunch break and feels cold dread settle in her chest. The archive's damage is beginning to affect consensus reality, warping the basic fabric of space-time in ways that technology can detect, even if human senses can't yet perceive it clearly. Early morning maintenance workers mention stonework that seems to glow in the pre-dawn darkness, a faint luminescence that fades as soon as the sun rises. Tour guides, her colleagues, people she's known for years, exchange confused stories about sections of the site that feel wrong, that make their skin prickle with unease for reasons they can't articulate. And the photographs start appearing. Tourists capturing strange lens flares that don't look like ordinary light artifacts, geometric patterns and what appear to be miniature star fields suspended in the air above certain stones. The images go viral on travel photography forums, debated endlessly. Digital glitches, elaborate hoaxes, evidence of electromagnetic anomalies. Amaya scrolls through the comment threads and knows exactly what she's seeing. The archive becoming visible, bleeding through the thin membrane that separates recorded futures from present experience. Her eyes are clouded with cataracts, but her gaze is sharp. She describes dreams of the terraces dissolving into stars, of walking the familiar paths and finding them transformed into rivers of light, of her grandchildren speaking in languages that haven't been invented yet. Other elders report similar visions, time fragmenting, realities overlapping, the solid world becoming fluid and strange. They don't understand what's happening, but they know it's significant, know it's connected to the sacred site that has anchored their community for generations. Some of them look at Amaya when they speak of these things, as if they sense her involvement, even if they can't name it directly. Amaya hears about it through her supervisor, who mentions increased scrutiny from the Cultural Heritage Office, concerns about energy surges detected by monitoring equipment installed throughout the site. Scientists are being consulted. There's talk of restricting access to certain areas pending investigation. Each piece of news tightens the vice of fear around her chest. Her margin for secret experimentation is narrowing. If she's caught now, with anomalies spreading and attention focusing on the site, the consequences won't just be professional. She could face criminal charges, destruction of heritage property, cultural vandalism, terrorism, depending on how aggressively they want to prosecute. And her family, her village, would be swept into the investigation, their precarious position made infinitely more unstable. She tells Picchu about the spreading anomalies during the next training session, her voice tight with controlled panic. The entity's response is to project a three-dimensional lattice of light into the guardhouse, a structure so complex it makes her eyes hurt to track its full extent. Timelines branch and converge in patterns that remind her of neurons, of river deltas, of mycelial networks spreading through soil. But as she watches, she sees the damage clearly. Branches fraying into static, entire sections of the lattice going dark as if erased, points where multiple timelines collapse into single catastrophic outcomes. The archive is failing faster than Picchu initially revealed. And the malfunction isn't just a cosmic abstraction, it's beginning to affect physical reality in measurable ways. Picchu's form pulses with something that might be regret. Without intervention, full collapse within 3 moon cycles. Perhaps less. 3 months. Maybe less than that before the archive fails completely, before the accumulated futures stored in this place fragment beyond recovery. What happens then? She's not sure she wants to know the answer, but she forces herself to ask. Picchu rotates the lattice, zooming in on the darkest sections. Localized time loops, cascading erasures, regions where causality becomes unstable, where the same moment repeats endlessly or where sequential events occur in random order. Your species calls it paradox. We call it temporal necrosis, the death of time's coherent flow. This is about preventing a disaster that could unravel the basic structure of reality in this region, that could trap people in broken loops of experience or erase entire sequences of history from existence. The scope of it is too large, too abstract, But Keshu frames it in terms she can grasp. If the archive fails, the children she saw in her first vision, all the possible children, all the branching futures, will never have the chance to exist. Every future, good or bad, will collapse into a single entropic outcome, where time itself becomes meaningless. A controlled reduction that preserves essential branches while eliminating unstable recursions. The words make sense in theory, but the implications are staggering. Amaya hears what Keshu is really saying. She will have to choose which futures live and which die, which possibilities deserve preservation, and which must be erased to save the rest. How can anyone make that choice? How can she decide which version of her nephew gets to exist, which configuration of her village deserves to continue into manifestation? Keshu chose her not because she's special, but because her bloodline carried the genetic memory of how to interface with the archive's technology, and because she was in the right place at the right moment when the being needed help. Circumstance and ancestry made her the de facto editor of timelines. And now she has to learn faster, practice harder, and prepare for a responsibility that no one should ever have to bear alone. Keshu pushes her through longer sessions, more complex sound patterns, deeper dives into the branching futures. Amaya's voice grows stronger from constant use, her fingers developing calluses in new places from hours with the flute. She learns to read the rings, not just visually but kinesthetically, feeling the difference between stable branches and unstable ones through subtle variations in the stone's vibration. She learns to hold multiple futures in her awareness simultaneously, to track the consequences of choices rippling forward through decades and generations. And slowly, painfully, she begins to develop the skills she'll need, the ability to compress timelines without destroying their essential information, to fold possibilities into each other in ways that preserve the core while eliminating redundancy. But the cost of this education is measured in sleepless nights, skipped meals, and a growing distance from everyone she loves. She's becoming something other than fully human, her consciousness stretching across temporal dimensions that have no names in any language she speaks. And the worst part is knowing that even if she succeeds, even if she saves the archive and prevents collapse, she can never tell anyone what she did or why. This will always be a secret she carries alone. Her stomach drops as the supervisor outlines the timeline. They'll sweep every restricted area, every abandoned structure, every place where unusual electromagnetic readings have been detected. The guardhouse where she's been training with Keshu will absolutely be included. But her mind is racing through options, all of them bad. She can't hide Keshu indefinitely. She can't explain the entity's presence if it's discovered. And she can't complete the archive compression alone. Not with the complexity increasing, not with the timelines fraying faster each night. She needs help, real help. Someone who understands technology and can think strategically about problems she can't even articulate properly. Someone she trusts absolutely. Which leaves only one person. Just pulls out her phone, navigates to the folder of clandestine footage she's been recording. Shaky clips of Keshu's luminous form, stones pulsing with rings of light, the three-dimensional lattice of timelines projected in the guardhouse. She hits play and watches her brother's expression transform from confusion to skepticism, to something close to awe. The video plays through its full sequence, Keshu teaching her a chant sequence, the stone responding with cascading patterns of light, brief glimpses of futures flickering within the rings. When it ends, silence fills the room like pressure before a storm. He reaches for the phone, rewinds, watches again. His hands are shaking slightly. She can see his mind working, trying to fit what he's seeing into any framework that makes sense, rejecting explanations and building new ones with the speed that's always made him good at arguments and analysis. When he turns back, his expression has shifted entirely. no longer skeptical, but burning with the kind of fierce excitement she recognizes from when he gets hold of an idea he thinks might change everything. "Do you understand what this means?" he asks, and there's something in his voice that makes her nervous. "This is proof, Amaya. Proof that our ancestors were part of something cosmic. Proof that Andean cultures weren't just building cities and farming terraces. They were collaborating with beings from outside our normal understanding of reality. This rewrites everything. Peru's place in global history, indigenous knowledge systems, the entire colonial narrative about primitive cultures being elevated by European contact. For Inti, this is an opportunity, a chance to leverage cosmic revelation for national recognition, to transform Peru from a country defined by tourism and resource extraction into one celebrated for harboring active contact with non-human intelligence. He's already thinking about media strategy, about how to frame the disclosure, about the global attention it would command. And Amaya realizes she's made a terrible mistake. She came to him for help with a specific technical crisis. He's seeing a platform for revolution. "Then we need to work fast. Show me where this guardhouse is. I can help. I can map the signal interference, track satellite coverage, figure out when and where we have blind spots in the new security system." He's in problem-solving mode now, the mode that makes him brilliant and occasionally reckless. Amaya tells herself this is what she wanted. His technical skills, his ability to navigate digital systems she barely understands. But watching him work, seeing the gleam in his eyes, she can't shake the feeling that she's just opened a door she won't be able to close. He works with the kind of focused intensity that shuts out everything else, occasionally muttering to himself as he maps signal strength and identifies gaps in coverage. Keshu watches from its corner, luminous form casting strange shadows across the rotting walls. The entity's attention is fixed on Inti with an intensity that Amaya finds unnerving, as if it's measuring him, calculating his usefulness and potential liability in equal measure. "Your brother carries ambition like a weapon," Keshu says directly into her mind, the words bypassing sound entirely. Amaya glances at Inti, who's too absorbed in his work to notice the silent communication. He sees what I am and thinks leverage. Not wrong, but dangerous. She knows Keshu is right. Inti isn't thinking about the archive's stability or the cosmic stakes of temporal collapse. He's thinking about documentation, about proof, about how to broadcast this revelation in ways that maximize impact and reshape narratives. His goals aren't evil. He genuinely believes that reclaiming Peru's place in global consciousness requires bold moves and irrefutable evidence. But his timeline for action is compressed by opportunity, not by the actual requirements of the work. He's already identified the new camera placements, the schedule for the inspection, the specific officials who'll be conducting the sweep. He can hack the feed, create loops that show empty spaces while they work. He can redirect satellite imagery. He can even manufacture false readings for the electromagnetic monitoring equipment, convince the investigators that the anomalies are equipment malfunctions or natural geological variations. His skills are real, his confidence justified, and Amaya feels the sick recognition that she needs what he's offering. Without his technical expertise, Keshu will be discovered and she'll be arrested. With it, they buy time to attempt the archive compression. When we stabilize the archive, when we've prevented the collapse, we go public. Controlled disclosure. I know people, journalists, academics, indigenous rights networks. We can frame this in ways that protect your work while ensuring Peru gets credit for harboring active contact with cosmic intelligence. She sees the future he's describing. International attention, scientific investigation, her face on news broadcasts, the site transformed into a circus of researchers and military observers and conspiracy theorists. Her village disrupted beyond recognition. her family's privacy destroyed, and the archive itself turned into a subject of study and exploitation, picked apart by people who'll never understand that it's not a resource to be leveraged, but a living system that demands respect and care. "I didn't agree to go public," she says carefully. Inti's expression hardens slightly. "Then what's the point? We save the archive, and then what? Keep it secret forever? Let the same colonial systems continue defining our history while we sit on proof that could change everything?" Inti leans forward, his face intense in the flickering light, making his case with the passion that makes him compelling and exhausting in equal measure. He talks about narrative power, about how indigenous peoples have been written out of their own histories by colonizers who dismissed their knowledge as superstition. He talks about how the revelation of the archive could overturn centuries of racist assumptions about technological advancement and cosmic significance. He talks about Peru's potential to lead a new understanding of human-cosmic relationships, to claim a place at the global table that's been denied through violence and erasure. The families who've lived in the valley for generations, whose connection to this place isn't abstract or symbolic, but daily and essential. "What about them?" she asks, interrupting his flow. "What happens to our village when international attention descends? When scientists and military personnel and tourism increases by an order of magnitude? When the government decides the site is too important to leave in local hands and relocates everyone for security purposes?" He's betting on systems that have never protected them before, gambling that this time will be different because the stakes are cosmic. She's not willing to risk her people on that bet. "I want to save the archive because it's failing, and collapse would be catastrophic," she says. "Not because I think it's a tool for rewriting Peru's international image. This isn't about narrative. It's about preventing disaster. The work requires prioritizing cosmic stability over individual outcomes. Human desires for justice, recognition, preservation of specific communities don't factor into the calculation except as variables affecting timeline stability. Minimize entropy. Preserve coherent causality. Let individual futures live or die based on their contribution to overall system health. It's logical, and it's monstrous. You're asking me to choose which futures deserve preservation based on abstract metrics of stability. Those are people's lives, children who might never exist, families who might be scattered or saved based on decisions I make about what configurations minimize entropy. Cashews form pulses with something that might be frustration. You think in terms of individuals. The archive thinks in terms of patterns. A timeline that preserves your nephew but destabilizes 3 adjacent branches is less valuable than one where he never exists, but 10,000 others find equilibrium. You cannot optimize for personal attachment and cosmic stability simultaneously. If the original builders, the Anunnaki or whoever, designed this system, they built in flexibility. There has to be a way to compress timelines while prioritizing ethical outcomes, preserving branches where indigenous communities thrive and colonial violence is minimized. And Amaya realizes they're embodying 3 fundamentally different approaches to the same crisis. She wants to protect her immediate community, the faces she knows and loves, willing to sacrifice grand narrative power if it means her village survives intact. Inti wants to leverage the archive for maximum political and cultural impact, willing to risk local disruption if it secures long-term recognition and rights for indigenous peoples on a national and global scale. Geshu wants pure system stability, willing to sacrifice any number of human futures if it prevents temporal collapse. And suddenly, they're not just arguing in the present moment. They're arguing across overlapping vision layers, their preferred futures bleeding into reality and interweaving with the shabby guardhouse and flickering fire. The sacred sites maintained by indigenous-led cooperatives that enforce strict quotas and seasonal closures. Tourism continues, but in balance, its economic benefits distributed equitably, its cultural impact minimized through careful management. It's not perfect. There are still conflicts, still negotiations with governmental authorities, still the daily grind of compromise. But her people survive. Their language continues. Their connection to place holds. Inti sees his desired timeline. Peru celebrated globally for harboring active contact with cosmic intelligence. International research centers built in partnership with indigenous communities. Andean knowledge systems taught in universities worldwide. His face on screens explaining the archive's significance, reframing 5 centuries of colonial narrative in a single generation. Resources flowing into the valley, schools, clinics, infrastructure funded by global fascination with the site's cosmic importance. And yes, there's disruption, crowds and cameras, and the loss of anonymity. But there's also power, recognition, a seat at tables where decisions get made. His people no longer dismissed or erased, but centered in humanity's understanding of its place in a larger cosmic context. Picchu sees its desired timeline, the archive compressed to a sparse, stable lattice, redundant branches pruned away, the system operating efficiently with minimal entropy, fewer futures preserved, but those that remain coherent and sustainable across millennia. Human suffering factors in only as it affects overall stability. Populations survive or perish based on their timeline's contribution to cosmic equilibrium. It's not cruel. The entity doesn't experience cruelty. It's optimization, logical, essential, and utterly indifferent to individual attachment. Picchu's sparse lattice trembles, a few carefully preserved timelines, insufficient to maintain the archive's core functions, stability achieved at the cost of the system's original purpose. The present reasserts itself with uncomfortable clarity. They're running out of time, their goals are fundamentally incompatible, and the archive is failing regardless of their philosophical differences. Because if we don't stabilize the archive soon, none of our preferred futures will have a chance to exist. Inti nods reluctantly, his earlier excitement tempered by the vision of his plan collapsing into chaos. Picchu's form dims to barely visible luminescence. Agreed, it says, but understand, compression will require choices, difficult ones. And whoever makes those choices will live with the knowledge of what they preserved and what they erased. And the worst part is understanding that this is just the beginning. The real test still lies ahead, when she has to stand at the archive's core and make choices about which futures deserve to exist. Amaya's breath comes in visible clouds as she climbs the familiar steps, her body heavy with exhaustion from too many sleepless nights and the weight of knowledge she never wanted to carry. The site is closed, the tourists long gone, and in the pre-midnight darkness the ruins feel less like a historical monument and more like what they truly are, a cosmic instrument, a technology for navigating realities that human language has no adequate framework to describe. Picchu's form is more unstable than ever, light bleeding from cracks that have widened since their last session, and there's an urgency in its movements that makes Amaya's stomach clench with dread. They stream through the darkness and into the stone, and the carved granite surface becomes transparent, revealing the vast computational substrate beneath. Crystalline matrices that extend down into the mountain's core, processing power that makes human technology look like children's toys. The valley unfolds around her in impossible dimensions, the same geography repeating and branching into countless variations, each one a different version of reality where different choices cascaded into different outcomes. She sees her village thriving in one branch and buried under landslides in another. She sees her nephew as a doctor, a farmer, a soldier, an artist, a corpse, a man who never existed because his parents never met in that particular configuration of events. Not gradually, suddenly, violently, whole clusters of timelines erased as if they never existed. She watches a branch where Peru becomes a global power, recognized for its cosmic heritage, and then it's gone, snuffed out like a flame. She watches a branch where indigenous peoples worldwide unite and overturn colonial systems, and then it's gone. She watches a branch where her nephew discovers a cure for a disease she doesn't recognize, saving millions of lives, and then it's gone. The erasure accelerates, spreading through the branching structure like infection, and Amaya realizes with horror that she's watching the archives collapse in real time. Not theoretical, not abstract, but actually happening right now, futures disappearing from the spectrum of possibility, because the system can no longer maintain their quantum coherence. Timelines collapsing into entropic void. If we do nothing, all of this disappears, not just the futures you don't prefer, but everything. Every possibility reduced to a single degraded outcome where causality itself becomes unstable. Entire branches pruned away to preserve the structural integrity of what remains. And the cost, the impossible, unbearable cost, is that she will have to choose. Not directly, perhaps, but the parameters she sets for the compression, the values she prioritizes, the patterns she decides to preserve or eliminate. These will determine which futures survive and which vanish forever. There's Maria, her neighbor's granddaughter, laughing as she runs across a terrace in one timeline, then gone. There's Carlos, a boy who doesn't exist yet in the present, but could. His face serious as he studies ancient texts in a future where her people's knowledge is preserved and celebrated. Then gone. There's a child she doesn't recognize, playing with technology that hasn't been invented, speaking a language that's evolved from Quechua in ways she can't predict. Then gone. They vanish like stars being extinguished, their laughter cutting off mid-breath, their whole existences, childhoods, relationships, accomplishments, descendants, erased from the possibility space as if they never mattered at all. And the ritual will erase countless configurations of them to preserve the system's stability. Wars rewind and dissolve, their millions of dead undying, only to be unlived entirely. Inventions flicker into being and vanish, their contributions to human knowledge erased before they could propagate. Social movements rise and fall and disappear, the liberation they might have achieved snuffed out along with the oppression that would have necessitated them. The full scope of what preservation requires, and something breaks inside her chest, a shattering so complete she doesn't have words for it. She's being asked to play God with timelines, to decide which versions of reality deserve existence and which can be sacrificed for the greater goal of systemic stability. How can anyone make that choice? How can she look at a child who might exist and decide that their particular configuration of DNA and experience and potential is less valuable than another child's, simply because their timeline happens to be more stable by Quechua's metrics? If I refuse the ritual, maybe some of the timelines survive naturally, maybe the collapse isn't total, maybe... But even as she speaks, she knows she's lying to herself. Quechua has shown her the math. Uncontrolled collapse is worse than compression. It's not mercy. It's abdication of responsibility, dressed up as moral purity, choosing to let chaos decide rather than making the hard choice herself. Inaction is still a choice, Quechua says, and the entity's tone carries something that might be compassion, though filtered through an alien psychology that can't fully grasp human attachment. The archive will fail regardless. The only question is whether it fails randomly, taking everything into entropy, or whether it fails under guidance, preserving what can be preserved. You cling to the fantasy that refusing to choose will somehow absolve you of responsibility. It won't. The children will die either way, but with the ritual some of them survive, without it none do. Below, the actual river winds through the valley, a dark ribbon reflecting stars. The beauty of it, the present moment, real and solid and still existing, feels like a knife in her chest. How many nights like this will be erased? How many people will never stand here and feel what she's feeling right now? It will only ensure that her cowardice, her inability to make impossible choices, results in total loss rather than terrible compromise. She thinks about the children she saw vanishing, and she thinks about the ones who might survive if she acts. She thinks about her nephew in the present, solid and real, and she knows that his existence in any future depends on the archive maintaining enough stability to support branching possibilities at all. "I'll do it," she says, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'll proceed with the ritual, but, and this is important, the thing she needs Keshu to understand, I'm not just following your instructions anymore. If I'm going to be responsible for this, if I'm going to carry the weight of all those erased futures for the rest of my life, then I get a say in how it's shaped. I'm not a tool, I'm a partner. And we negotiate the compression parameters based on what preserves community, continuity, connection, not just abstract temporal stability. The solstice gives us optimal conditions for the ritual, but that's less than 2 weeks away. We must work quickly. The weight of it settles over her shoulders like stone, but she stands anyway, wiping her face with the back of her hand and looks Keshu in what might be eyes. Not peace. She'll never have peace about this, but purpose, clarity, the acceptance that some choices are terrible not because you're making them wrong, but because the situation itself offers no good options, only variations of tragedy that differ in scope and distribution. It's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's what she has. He looks up when she enters, his face alight with the kind of dangerous excitement she's learned to recognize. The expression he gets when he's convinced he's figured out how to change the world. Broadcast the ritual live. Show the world what's actually happening here. Proof that can't be denied or dismissed. He gestures at a diagram showing signal paths bouncing between satellites and ground stations, overlaid with timelines and network routing protocols. Broadcasting the compression ritual, the moment when she'll be choosing which futures live and which die, to a global audience that will have no context for what they're witnessing. Tourists and journalists and government officials watching as she performs cosmic triage, reducing their reactions to content, their awe and horror becoming just another viral moment in an endless stream of sensationalized revelation. This isn't entertainment, Inti. It's not a tool for narrative disruption or political leverage. She struggles to find words that will penetrate his enthusiasm. It's an act of cosmic responsibility that requires reverence and care, not an audience. But that's exactly why the world needs to see it. For centuries, indigenous knowledge has been dismissed as superstition, while European frameworks get celebrated as science. This is proof. Undeniable, visual, impossible to dismiss proof that our ancestors were working with technology that makes modern physics look primitive. If we keep it secret, nothing changes. The same systems that threaten our village, that control access to our sacred sites, that treat us as obstacles to tourism revenue, those systems continue. But if we go public, everything shifts. Peru becomes the center of humanity's understanding of cosmic reality. And we, indigenous peoples, get recognized as guardians of knowledge that matters on a universal scale. The site declared a matter of national security and locked down entirely, with her community relocated for safety and the archive picked apart by researchers who'll never understand that it's a living system requiring relationship, not a resource to be extracted and studied. The ritual is going to be hard enough without turning it into a media event. Please, Inti, trust me on this. Some things need to stay sacred and private, not because we're hiding them out of fear, but because they require space that spectacle destroys. He's already invested days of work into the transmission infrastructure, already convinced himself the global broadcast is the ethical choice, the brave choice, the move that history will vindicate. And she realizes with sinking certainty that she's going to have to choose between supporting her brother's vision and protecting the integrity of the ritual, between family loyalty and cosmic responsibility, between his dream of recognition and her duty to minimize harm. The argument will continue over the coming days, she knows. But for now, she's too exhausted to fight. She sinks down onto the floor, her back against the cold stone wall, and watches Inti work with the kind of focused intensity that shuts out everything else. And she wonders how many versions of this moment exist across the branching timelines, configurations where she convinces him, where she doesn't, where they find compromise, where they shatter into irreconcilable conflict. How many of those branches will survive the compression? How many Intis, with their bright eyes and dangerous ideas, will vanish like extinguished stars? The luminescence that once defined its boundaries now bleeds into the surrounding air like watercolor diffusing through water. New cracks spider across the stonework near where it stands, and Amaya can see that the entity's connection to the physical world is becoming increasingly tenuous. It's not just wounded anymore, it's actively deteriorating, the damage accelerating in ways that suggest its time in this reality is measured in days rather than weeks. The system indicators are worsening, Keshu says, and there's an edge of something like fear in its voice for the first time since Amaya met it. Cascade points are appearing throughout the archive. Sections that should be stable are showing signs of imminent collapse. We may not have until the solstice. We may need to attempt compression sooner. I don't know how to navigate the compression in ways that preserve the branches I need to preserve. If we move too fast... But Keshu cuts her off with a gesture that sends light bleeding across the floor. If we wait too long, there will be nothing left to preserve. You must train harder, study faster. The children you saw vanishing, that wasn't a possible future. That was happening in real time as the archive fails. Every hour we delay, more timelines collapse beyond recovery. And Keshu's growing impatience isn't helping. The entity has become rigid and demanding, pressuring her to hurry through exercises that require careful attention, dismissing her concerns about preserving specific community-centered futures as inefficient sentimentality. And if you want me to shape this compression ethically rather than just randomly pruning whatever's convenient, then you need to give me time to study the patterns that might preserve what matters. Time is what we don't have. Every moment spent studying is a moment the archive degrades further. You must trust your instincts. Your bloodline carries genetic memory of how to interface with this system. Let that guide you when knowledge falls short. She simply nods, pulls herself to her feet despite exhaustion that makes her bones ache, and gestures for Keshu to begin the next training session. They work through the night, her voice growing hoarse from chanting, her fingers cramping around the flute, her consciousness stretching across temporal dimensions until she can barely remember what singular linear time feels like. Hours until the archive's cascade points trigger irreversible collapse. Minutes until she has to stand at the Intihuatana stone and become the person who chooses which children get to laugh in future sunlight and which disappear into the void like they never mattered at all. Because what choice does she have? Walk away and let chaos decide? That's not protection. That's cowardice dressed up as moral purity. And she's done with pretending that refusing to choose will somehow keep her hands clean. The archive is failing. The ritual is necessary. And she's the only one who can shape it in ways that might preserve fragments of what she loves. Through the growing certainty that no matter how carefully she plans, no matter how hard she tries to minimize harm, she will carry the weight of erased futures for the rest of her life. And she prays, in Quechua, in Spanish, in languages that have no names, that when the moment comes, her hands will be steady enough to choose wisely. Amaya watches from her position near the entrance gates as uniformed inspectors emerge, followed by scientists carrying heavy cases of equipment, And then, most alarming, 3 military observers in civilian clothes whose posture and watchful silence mark them as security personnel. Her supervisor calls an emergency meeting of all guides and staff, his face tight with the kind of carefully controlled panic that comes from dealing with authorities you can't afford to offend. The official explanation is safety concerns and anomaly investigation, but everyone understands what's really happening. The government is asserting control over a site that's generating too much unexplained attention, too many viral videos and tourist reports of impossible phenomena. Checkpoints appear at strategic locations throughout the site, manned by inspectors with clipboards who log every person's movements and question any deviation from approved paths. Scientists deploy their instruments, electromagnetic sensors, ground-penetrating radar, devices Amaya doesn't recognize that hum and click as they sweep across the ancient stonework. And threading through everything, the quiet, unsettling presence of the military observers who watch without appearing to watch, who catalogue faces and patterns of movement with the kind of attention that suggests they're building files on everyone present. Every tour she leads is shadowed by at least one inspector, supposedly ensuring compliance with new safety protocols, but actually monitoring what she says, how she says it, where she takes visitors. Her radio crackles constantly with instructions and check-ins, tracking her location with precision that leaves no room for unscheduled detours. The restricted areas, including the section where the guardhouse sits abandoned and officially off-limits, are now marked with official signage and monitored by roving patrols. Access requires authorization forms and logged entry times. And worst of all, her supervisor pulls her aside after lunch to mention that staff will be subject to background checks and enhanced scrutiny, given the sensitive nature of the investigation. Translation: they're looking for problems, for people who might be connected to the anomalies, for convenient scapegoats if the situation escalates. And beneath the immediate practical concerns lies deeper dread. If they find Picchu, if they discover the archive's true nature before she can complete the compression, the result won't be careful study and scientific collaboration. It will be military lockdown, her village relocated, and the entity dissected or contained in ways that guarantee the archive's complete collapse. The radio on her belt crackles with an alert that makes her blood go cold. Inspection team requesting clearance to check abandoned structures in Sector 7. The guardhouse. They're going to the guardhouse. She glances at her watch. The next tour doesn't start for 20 minutes, just enough time if she runs, and if she's lucky, and if Inti is already there, and if the stones cooperate. She mutters an excuse about equipment check and moves fast. Not quite running, because running would draw attention, but walking with the kind of purposeful stride that suggests official business rather than panic. Her radio continues its steady stream of chatter, teams coordinating, equipment being moved, someone requesting additional scanning equipment for electromagnetic anomalies. She reaches the structure just as Inti emerges from inside, his face pale with alarm. He's heard the same alert. They have minutes, maybe less. Amaya and Inti move with frantic efficiency, born of disaster preparation, grabbing the tarp they've kept hidden for exactly this scenario and throwing it over the corner where Picchu typically manifests. The luminescence bleeds through the fabric, still visible, unmistakably wrong. Inti starts stacking old supply crates and broken equipment to create a barrier, anything to block the direct line of sight. Amaya sweeps training materials, her flute, her grandmother's bundle of coca leaves, the stones she's been using for practice, into her pack with shaking hands. The entity's electromagnetic signature will register on their instruments. The strange patterns of decay in the wood and stone around where it's been dwelling will raise questions. And if they get close enough to actually see through the camouflage, there's no explanation that will prevent immediate detention and investigation. And then, A sound like thunder compressed into a single instant, a shockwave of energy that doesn't originate from the guardhouse, but from the stones themselves, from the terraces and walls and carved surfaces throughout the entire site, responding to the entity's distress. Amaya feels it roll through her body, sees Inti stagger as the wave passes, hears the inspection team outside curse in confusion as their instruments go haywire. Electromagnetic interference, massive and sudden, overwhelming every sensor within range. Amaya forces herself to breathe normally, her official badge visible on her chest, her posture suggesting she has every right to be here checking on old equipment storage. The woman's gaze lingers on the tarp, and Amaya prepares for questions she can't answer. But then one of the other inspectors calls from outside about similar interference bursts at multiple locations, and the woman's attention shifts. She makes a notation on her tablet, tells Amaya and Inti that this area is restricted pending further investigation, and leaves with her team to investigate the other surge points. Seconds from everything collapsing, Picchu captured or destroyed, she and Inti detained, their family investigated, the village subjected to enhanced scrutiny that could provide exactly the excuse authorities need to proceed with relocation plans. They survived only because the archive itself intervened, producing interference that bought them minutes of cover. The next time they come, they'll be prepared for interference. They'll have shielded equipment, and they will come back. You heard her. This area is restricted pending further investigation. Picchu's response is a pulse of light that feels like exhaustion mixed with grim acknowledgement. Then we accelerate the timeline. The ritual happens before they return, or we accept that discovery is inevitable. For once, his usual confidence is cracked, the reality of tangible danger puncturing his enthusiasm for grand gestures and narrative disruption. He's been treating this like an intellectual exercise, a chess game where clever moves guarantee victory. But the inspection team wasn't theoretical, the risk of detention wasn't abstract, and in his eyes, Amaya sees the dawning recognition that the stakes they're playing for include their freedom and their family's safety in immediate, concrete ways that no amount of political theory can ameliorate. By the time they leave the guardhouse and return to their respective responsibilities, Amaya to her tours, Inti to his work in the village, she can see his mind already spinning the event into a different narrative. Not a close call that demands caution, but confirmation that time is running out and bold action is necessary. The inspection team's presence proves the government is aware something significant is happening, which means, from his perspective, the window for controlled disclosure is closing. If they're going to broadcast the ritual and frame Peru's cosmic heritage on their own terms, they need to move fast before authorities impose their own narrative. Emir finds Inti there after finishing her shift, staring down at their village where lights are beginning to glow in windows as families settle in for the night. The mountains loom on all sides, their silhouettes sharp against the darkening sky. Wind carries the smell of cooking fires and the distant sound of someone's radio playing music. It's peaceful, ordinary. The kind of moment that feels precious because she knows how fragile it is, how easily this entire way of life could be disrupted beyond recognition. He turns to face her, his expression intense in the fading light, and launches immediately into his position. Make it impossible for them to hide what's happening. Force the conversation onto our terms. He's passionate, articulate, his logic internally consistent, even if she rejects its premises. He talks about indigenous peoples finally claiming their place in humanity's cosmic story, about Peru recognized not as a developing nation dependent on tourism and resource extraction, but as harboring active contact with non-human intelligence, about their village becoming sacred ground that can't be casually displaced because the world will be watching. "You're treating our home as collateral," she says, her voice low and dangerous. You're willing to sacrifice the village we have now, the actual people living their actual lives down there, for a theoretical future where global attention somehow protects us instead of destroying us. You think cameras and international interest will prevent relocation? I think it guarantees it. The government will declare the site a matter of national security, relocate everyone for safety, and turn this entire valley into a militarized research zone. And our people, our family, will be scattered to cities where they'll forget the language, forget the stories, forget what it means to be connected to this place. That's the same mentality that's kept us weak and invisible for centuries. Don't make waves, don't demand recognition, just survive quietly and hope the systems that exploit you don't notice enough to crush you completely. I'm offering something different. A chance to be seen, to be heard, to matter on a scale that might actually change our structural position rather than just managing our oppression more carefully. Their village exists in a perpetual state of precarity, always one policy change away from displacement, always vulnerable to forces beyond their control. But that doesn't mean publicity is the answer. It just means there are no good answers, only variations of compromise and risk that differ in who pays the price and when. This is about the ritual itself, the most sacred, terrible thing I'll ever do. I'll be standing at that stone, choosing which futures get to exist and which vanish forever. Children Inti, entire configurations of human possibility. And you want to turn that into a broadcast event. You want to frame cosmic triage as content for global consumption. That's not protection, that's desecration. It's turning something that demands reverence into spectacle. Maybe she is too cautious, too attached to privacy and intimacy as values, but she's also the one who's seen the children vanishing like extinguished stars. She's the one who'll carry the weight of erased futures, and she knows in her bones that adding global audience to that moment won't make it more powerful. It will make it performative, will transform genuine cosmic responsibility into theater. The argument continues, voices rising, old sibling dynamics mixing with genuine ideological conflict. Amaya accuses him of treating their village as expendable proof of concept for his political theories. He accuses her of being so afraid of change that she'll cling to survival mode, even when bolder action might actually secure long-term protection. They're both right, they're both wrong, and neither has the power to fully convince the other because they're arguing from fundamentally different premises about what protection looks like and who deserves to decide. Amaya watches him go and feels something crack in her chest. Not just disagreement, but actual rupture, the kind of familial break that doesn't heal cleanly even if they eventually reconcile. This is a war of narratives, and exposure is sometimes the only protection available to the powerless. I hope you understand, but even if you don't, I'm doing this. He's going to turn the most private, sacred moment of her life into a global event because he genuinely believes that publicity will save them, and that her caution is just another form of surrender. And she understands with terrible clarity that she now has to choose, stop him, which might mean betraying her brother and destroying their relationship, let him proceed, which might mean destroying the ritual's integrity and guaranteeing the kind of chaotic governmental response she's most afraid of, or find some third option that doesn't exist, some magical compromise that preserves both relationship and responsibility without sacrificing either. The mountains offer no answers. The valley below continues its peaceful evening routines, unaware that decisions being made right now will determine whether those houses still stand in a year, whether those families remain connected or scattered, whether the children sleeping in those rooms will grow up rooted or displaced. And Amaya stands at the overlook, watching lights flicker in windows, and understands that she's run out of time for delay. The ritual is coming. Intai is committed to his plan. The inspection team will return, and she's being forced into decisive action by the collapse of every careful strategy she's used to avoid exactly this kind of impossible choice. She thinks about her nephew asleep in his bed right now, solid and real and unaware that his future hangs in a balance determined by sonic patterns and timeline compression algorithms he'll never understand. She thinks about all the versions of him that might exist across branching futures, and all the versions that will be erased when she stands at the Intihuatana and makes choices no human should have to make. And she realizes she's been trying to find a path that doesn't require betrayal, that doesn't demand she sacrifice anyone or anything. But that path doesn't exist. It never did. Every choice available to her now involves betrayal of something essential: family loyalty or cosmic responsibility, privacy or recognition, careful preservation or bold political action. She's conflict-averse by nature, trained since childhood to find compromises that keep everyone minimally satisfied. But this situation doesn't accommodate compromise. It demands decision, and her fatal flaw, seeking perfect, painless outcomes, has left her vulnerable to manipulation by larger systems that exploit her hesitation. Inti represents revolutionary action that could secure recognition or guarantee disaster. Keshu represents cosmic priorities that treat human attachment as irrelevant noise. And caught between these forces, Amaya has to stop waiting for a perfect solution that will never arrive and start acting with whatever imperfect tools she has. She can't control Inti's choices. She can't prevent the inspection team from returning. She can't make the ritual less terrible than it is. But she can show up, prepared as possible, and shape what she can shape, while accepting that much will remain beyond her control. It's not the harmonious integration of tradition and modernity she wanted. It's not the perfect path that preserves everyone and betrays no one. But it's what's available to her in this moment, with these constraints, given who she is and what she knows. Keshu finds her in the guardhouse 3 nights before the solstice, her body heavy with exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. The entity's form is barely holding coherence now, light bleeding from cracks that have spread like spiderwebs across its entire structure. But its awareness remains sharp, focused, and when it extends what might be a hand toward her, Amaya knows she's about to see something she doesn't want to witness. "You carry too much fear of your own erasure," Keshu says. And before she can protest or prepare, reality folds like terraces stacking into impossible dimensions. In one timeline, she dies 3 days from now. Not dramatically, just a stumble on wet stone, a fall, a head striking granite at exactly the wrong angle. She watches herself bleed out on the familiar paths while tourists scream and guides radio for help that arrives too late. The ritual never happens, the archive collapses, and her last thought as darkness closes in is wondering if anyone will understand what was lost. Inti never came to her room that night, never saw the footage. In this configuration, he leaves the valley entirely, not out of ambition but desperation. The village offers no future for young men with education and ideas, so he takes work with an illegal mining operation in a different region. She sees him years older, hands scarred, eyes dead, operating equipment that poisons rivers and destroys mountains for trace amounts of gold. He sends money home. It keeps the family fed. And he dies inside a little more each day, his dreams of narrative power and indigenous recognition eroded by the grinding necessity of survival in an extractive economy that sees him as disposable labor. She watches the valley caught in temporal loops, the same Tuesday repeating endlessly for a group of tourists who slowly go mad realizing no Wednesday will ever come. Families trapped in recursive patterns of the same conversations, the same meals, the same dawns that never progress toward change, pockets of broken causality spreading like infection, time becoming meaningless. And she sees herself in that branch too, aware of what's happening, but powerless to fix it. watching her nephew age backward and forward simultaneously until his existence becomes a quantum blur of contradictory states that can't resolve into singular coherent life. Timelines where Inti's broadcast triggers immediate military intervention, and she's detained before reaching the Intihuatana. Timelines where Keshu's deterioration reaches critical failure mid-ritual and takes her consciousness with it into entropic void. Timelines where she succeeds perfectly, but the compression erases so much that the surviving futures feel barren, empty of the richness and possibility that made existence worth preserving. And underneath all of them, the terrible truth: none of these timelines has more inherent right to exist than any other. The version of her that dies from a fall is just as real, just as valid, just as deserving of life as the version kneeling in the guardhouse right now. The Inti who wastes his potential in illegal mining isn't a lesser configuration. He's a human being whose suffering matters absolutely. The tourists caught in time loops aren't abstractions. They're people with families who will search for them forever. Children who will never understand why parents disappeared into a site that broke the basic rules of reality. It's about deciding that some versions of herself, of Inti, of everyone she loves, will simply never exist, because their timelines happen to be unstable or redundant by metrics she barely understands. How can anyone make that choice? How can she look at a version of herself and decide that particular configuration of consciousness doesn't deserve to experience reality? You cannot save everyone, Keshu says, and its voice carries neither cruelty nor comfort, just statement of fact. Including yourself. The compression will preserve some branches and eliminate others. You may not survive in all configurations, and that is the price of responsibility. Accepting that your own existence is contingent, not guaranteed, subject to the same calculus as every other potential future. And she understands why Keshu showed her this, because she's been operating under the unconscious assumption that she'll survive to carry the weight of her choices, that her punishment for playing God with timelines will be living with the guilt. But that's not guaranteed. She might make the choices and then vanish, erased along with countless others, her sacrifice never known or acknowledged by the futures that survive. It should make the responsibility lighter. If she might not survive to feel guilt, why does the choice matter? But it doesn't. It makes everything heavier. Because if she's going to risk her own existence, if she's going to potentially erase herself along with so many others, then she has to be absolutely certain she's choosing as carefully as possible, with full awareness and maximum reverence for what's being lost, but not blindly following Keshu's parameters or Inti's political ambitions or her own desire for painless outcomes. She'll do it with eyes open, aware that she's making terrible choices that might include her own erasure, and she'll ensure that the compression preserves whatever fragments of meaning and memory can be saved from the lost configurations. A small-scale activation of the ritual's first phase to verify that the sound sequences and compression parameters are correct. Keshu advises against it. Too risky, too likely to destabilize already fragile structures. But Amaya insists. If the ritual is going to work at all, they need to confirm the mechanics before attempting full compression. And privately, she needs to know that she can actually do this, that when the moment comes, her voice will hold steady, and her hands won't shake too badly to maintain the flute patterns. Just before dawn, with the inspection team occupied by anomalies in other sectors that Inti has been carefully manufacturing through strategic equipment interference, Amaya stands among ancient stones and begins to chant. The first syllables roll off her tongue with increasing confidence. The pattern Keshu taught her now burned into muscle memory. The stones respond, rings of light pulsing across their surfaces. She adds the flute sequence, layering frequencies, guiding the compression test toward the parameters they've established. The terraces around her don't just glow, they dissolve into starlight, solid granite becoming transparent, revealing the computational substrate beneath, and then part of the slope above the valley simply gives way. The landslide isn't massive, not enough to destroy the whole settlement, but it's enough to scar the slope, enough to send dust billowing through streets, enough to wake everyone in terror, rushing from their homes in panic, unsure if the mountain itself is collapsing. The landslide has already happened. Through the settling dust, she can see people in the streets below, small figures pointing and shouting. She can hear sirens in the distance, and she knows with sickening certainty that she just gave authorities exactly the justification they need to restrict access further, to evacuate the village, to declare the site unstable and the local population at risk. She stands among cracked stones, her flute still gripped in shaking hands, and wants to vomit. This is her fault. Her insistence on testing, her interference with forces she doesn't fully understand. And even though Keshu will tell her that the test revealed necessary information about cascade point sensitivity, even though the ritual adjustment they can make based on this failure might prevent total collapse, she can't stop seeing those people fleeing their homes, can't stop knowing that she caused that terror and damage through her own actions. She meets Inti and Keshu in the guardhouse an hour later, all three of them lit differently by the trembling glow of the archive's destabilized regions. Hairline fractures spider across the floor and walls, visible evidence of structural damage that goes deeper than stone. The air feels wrong, charged and unstable, as if reality itself is thinner here now, the membrane between present moment and branching futures worn dangerously close to tearing. Amaya can't stop apologizing, the words pouring out in a stream she can't control. She blames herself for pushing the test, for not recognizing the cascade point vulnerability, for possibly triggering the exact disaster she's been trying to prevent. Inti stands across from her, arms crossed, and for once his expression isn't triumphant or argumentative. He looks frightened, actually frightened in a way she's never seen from him. "This proves we can't wait," he says. "We need to do the full ritual now, before another cascade triggers spontaneously, and we need witnesses, documentation, because if this goes wrong, people need to understand what happened and why." She just nods dumbly, unable to muster the energy to fight him when she's fighting herself, battling the voice in her head that says she should never have gotten involved, should have let Keshu find someone else, should have walked away when she still could. The entity's form is barely holding together now, light bleeding freely from wounds that no longer seem bounded by any coherent structure. "The test revealed critical information," it says. "The cascade points are more sensitive than I calculated. The window for controlled compression is narrower. We proceed at the solstice as planned, but with modified parameters. The alternative is spontaneous collapse within days, possibly hours. This is not a choice anymore. It is necessity." Keshu sees only metrics and timelines, and the approaching point where intervention becomes impossible. "I'll meet you here tomorrow night." And before either can protest, she's gone, stumbling out into the pre-dawn cold, her mind a chaos of guilt and responsibility and the growing certainty that she's completely, catastrophically out of her depth. The inspection team that will absolutely notice fresh cracks and slope damage, that will tighten security even further, that might prevent her from accessing the Intihuatana at all when the solstice comes. She's failed at every level. As a sister, as a guardian, as the person who was supposed to navigate this crisis with skill and care. It's older than Machu Picchu itself, an arrangement of stones that predates the Inca road system, maintained by families who remember that this land was sacred long before empire or tourism. She kneels among candles that previous visitors have left, adds her own offerings from the bundle she still carries, despite everything, and lets the tears come freely. From here, they look less like a monument and more like what they are, a cosmic instrument built by beings who understood that time is not linear, that futures branch and converge, that human choices ripple forward into consequences beyond individual comprehension. And she thinks about the stories her grandmother told her, stories of warriors and weavers and guardians who made impossible choices without guarantees of success or survival. There was the weaver who destroyed her own masterwork because the pattern held power that would have been misused if it survived. There was the warrior who walked into enemy territory knowing he would die, but trusting that his sacrifice would buy time for children to escape. There was the guardian of a sacred spring who chose to poison the water herself when invaders came, ensuring that if her people couldn't have access to its healing properties, neither would those who'd steal and commodify it. None of them had guarantees. None of them got painless solutions, and all of them carried the weight of their choices into whatever came after. Death, exile, the judgment of communities who didn't always understand what had been sacrificed or why. Amaya has been seeking a path that doesn't require sacrifice, a perfect solution that preserves everyone and betrays no one, a way to harmonize tradition and modernity and cosmic responsibility without loss or pain. But that path doesn't exist. It never existed. And her desire for painless outcomes has been a refusal to accept the adult weight of responsibility, the understanding that some choices are terrible not because you're making them wrong, but because the situation itself offers only variations of tragedy. Warmth rises under her palms, as if the mountains themselves are listening. The stars overhead seem to align into patterns that mirror the terraces, not literally, but symbolically, as if the cosmos is acknowledging her presence and her struggle. And in that moment of connection, she understands something fundamental that shifts the entire framework of her thinking. The real violence would be pretending she can save everyone, hiding the cost of compression, and then living with the secret knowledge that countless configurations of reality were erased without acknowledgement or meaning. If she's going to do this, if she's going to stand at that stone and compress timelines and erase futures, then she must do it with full awareness, with reverence, with the commitment that those who are lost will not be erased without memory, that their potential existence will be honored even in erasure, that she will carry the weight of what's been sacrificed for the rest of her life and never pretend it didn't matter. She can choose with eyes open, bear witness to what's being erased, and make certain that her choices preserve not just stable timelines, but meaningful ones, futures where memory and connection and reverence for sacrifice remain possible. It's not mercy, but it's better than the alternative, letting chaos decide, letting the archive collapse randomly with no consciousness guiding which branches survive and which vanish into entropy. She stands, her body steadier than it's been in days. The guilt doesn't disappear. She'll carry that forever, and should, but it no longer paralyzes her. She's accepted that the ritual will happen, that she will make terrible choices, that some configurations of reality, possibly including versions of herself, will cease to exist. And she's resolved to do it with maximum consciousness and care, to honor what's lost even as she participates in its erasure, to ensure that the futures that survive are ones where this kind of reverence remains possible. She's done trying to find perfect solutions. She's done seeking painless outcomes. Tomorrow night she'll tell them her decision. The ritual proceeds at the solstice, but on her terms, with parameters that prioritize not just stability, but meaning, with the understanding that she'll carry this weight forever and never pretend it was anything other than terrible necessity. The night before the solstice, she'll stand at the Intihuatana stone and do something that should be impossible: compress infinity into finite structures, erase countless futures to save the rest, become the person who chooses which children get to laugh in future sunlight and which vanish like extinguished stars. And she'll do it not because she's certain it's right, but because the alternative, abdicating responsibility and letting chaos decide, would be a worse violence. She's terrified, she's ready, And she's finally accepted that those two states can coexist, that mature responsibility means acting despite fear, not waiting for fear to dissolve. Her grandmother's stories make sense now in ways they never did before. The warriors and weavers and guardians weren't fearless. They were terrified. But they showed up anyway, made impossible choices without guarantees, and trusted that consciousness and care might be enough to tip terrible necessity toward the least harmful possible outcome. Solstice night arrives with the kind of clarity that feels like judgment. The Milky Way blazes overhead in a river of light so bright it casts shadows, mirroring the winding path of the Urubamba below, where the actual river curves through the valley like a dark ribbon threaded between mountains. Imaya climbs the familiar paths toward the Intihuatana, her pack heavy with offerings and ritual instruments, her grandmother's flute, bundles of coca leaves, woven cloth that her mother helped her prepare without asking questions she knew wouldn't be answered. Each step feels weighted with finality, as if she's climbing not just toward the stone, but toward a moment that will define the rest of her life, however long or short that remainder might be. Keshu glides beside her, its form more apparition than substance now. The entity looks like a wounded comet made of stone light, luminescence bleeding from cracks that have consumed most of its coherent structure. It moves with visible effort, the air around it distorting in ways that suggest its connection to physical reality is maintained only through desperate will. Amaya glances at it and feels a spike of fear. If Keshu collapses before the ritual completes, what happens to the compression? What happens to her consciousness if it's linked to the entity when that link severs? But there's no point asking questions that have no answers. She keeps climbing. Cables and modified antennas, a laptop wrapped in protective foam, portable power banks and signal boosters cobbled together from consumer electronics and technical knowledge gained through late-night forums and hacker communities. He's been preparing for this moment since she first showed him the footage, convinced that broadcasting the ritual is the only way to secure their people's place in the global conversation that will follow. Imaya knows he's back there, knows he's setting up his satellite rig at strategic points, and she's made her peace with it. She can't stop him without betraying him, and she's done trying to control outcomes she has no power over. Her responsibility is the compression itself. Everything else, how the world responds, how her family reacts, how authorities move in the aftermath, is beyond her capacity to manage. Security forces are scrambling below, visible as flashlight beams, cutting through darkness, and radio chatter crackling across frequencies that bleed into her own receiver. The anomalies are spiking, instruments detecting electromagnetic surges that defy normal parameters. Someone shouts orders about evacuating the site. Someone else argues about waiting for additional personnel. The confusion buys time, creates space for her to reach the Intihuatana without immediate interference, but it won't last. The moment the ritual begins in earnest, every sensor within range will scream alerts, and whatever fragile window exists will slam shut. The carved granite pillar rises from its base like a sundial, like an anchor, like a key inserted into the lock of reality itself. Amaya sets down her pack and begins the preparation sequence, laying out offerings in patterns Keshu taught her, positions that correspond to regions of the archive that need maximum stabilization. Her hands shake as she arranges the coca leaves, the woven cloth, the small carved stones her grandfather made before he died. This is real. This is happening. In minutes, she'll begin the chant that will compress timelines and erase countless futures. And there's no practice run, no safety net, no guarantee that she'll survive the attempt. And maybe she could. The boundary between metaphor and reality is already thinning, the ritual space becoming liminal in ways that make ordinary physics suggestions rather than laws. She can feel it in the air, in the stone beneath her feet, in the way her own consciousness seems to spread beyond the usual boundaries of her skull. It projects numbers and geometric patterns across its surface. Equations, probability calculations, compression algorithms rendered in luminous symbols that bloom and shatter like ice crystals, forming and dissolving. The entity is preparing to interface fully with the archive, to channel Amaya's sonic inputs into the deeper computational substrate that processes reality branching. And as it does, Amaya sees with sudden clarity how wounded it really is. Picchu is dying, has been dying since before she met it. The ritual will almost certainly finish what the initial damage began, burning out what remains of its coherence in the effort to stabilize the system it was built to maintain. So she simply nods, turns toward the Intihuatana, and places her hands on the stone. Security forces shout into dead receivers, their communications infrastructure reduced to useless, expensive paperweights. Above, the drones they deployed hours ago begin falling from the sky like shot birds, their navigation systems unable to maintain coherence in the electromagnetic chaos the archive generates when it wakes. She can't see him from here, but she knows he's watching screens that are glitching between live footage and something else, symbols of unknown origin that cascade across displays like digital rain. The broadcast is happening, feeds bouncing through satellites and landing in servers that will disseminate them to news networks and social media platforms and academic institutions. The ritual is becoming spectacle, even as it remains sacred. The tension between those states unresolved and maybe unresolvable. The Intihuatana responds immediately, concentric rings of light pulsing across its surface and spreading to the stones around the platform. Each ring corresponds to a cluster of futures, and as her chant progresses, the rings begin to fold into each other, redundant timelines collapsing, possibilities pruning away like branches cut from a tree. Overhead, the sky changes. Not the physical sky that remains clear and star-filled, but a layer of reality that exists in parallel, visible only because the ritual has made her consciousness wide enough to perceive it. She sees futures like auroras, like curtains of light flickering in configurations that represent different branches of possibility. And as she plays and chants, those curtains begin to fade. A timeline where her nephew becomes a doctor vanishes, the potential erased as if it never existed. A timeline where her village develops sustainable tourism practices that serve as a model for indigenous communities worldwide flickers and goes dark. A timeline where Inti's broadcast triggers a global awakening about human cosmic relationships, collapses into non-existence. She feels each erasure as physical pain, not metaphorical, not psychological, but actual ache that radiates through her body like shockwaves. Children never born, wars never fought, discoveries vanishing before they could propagate into technological advancement, love stories that will never reach their conclusions, grief that will never be processed, joy that will never be felt. All of it pruned away in service of stability, sacrificed so that the remaining branches can hold coherent causality. So she keeps chanting, keeps playing, keeps guiding the collapse toward parameters that might preserve her village, her family, the possibility of reverence and memory in whatever futures survive. But mostly, the feeds show static, interference so profound that the broadcast becomes more proof of anomaly than documentation of event. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe the ritual is too sacred, too terrible to be fully witnessed by those who aren't standing in it. Maybe some experiences resist translation into content, remaining private even when technically public. Numbers bloom across its surface and shatter before resolving into meaningful equations. Geometric patterns appear and collapse, and the entity's voice cuts through her concentration, resonating directly in her bones. Hurry! Instability is spiking beyond safe parameters. The compression must complete before cascade failure propagates to stable regions. Not because she's being stubborn or resistant, but because the work demands precision that haste would destroy. Each verse of the chant must land exactly right, or the compression becomes random pruning rather than guided selection. Each note of the flute sequence must hold its pitch, or the timelines fold incorrectly, creating new instabilities rather than resolving existing ones. She's operating at the absolute edge of her capacity, her consciousness stretched across dimensions she can barely perceive, and rushing would guarantee catastrophic failure. Not to defy Keshu, but because she's listening for something the entity can't hear. Subtle responses from the mountains themselves, feedback from the conscious presence that inhabits this place and has been watching her since before she understood she was being watched. The citadel is alive in ways that go beyond archive and computational substrate. It remembers, it grieves, and it has opinions about which futures deserve preservation and which can be released. When she slows the third verse and holds the note longer than Keshu's parameters specify, she feels it, a warmth rising through the stone, a response that suggests approval, or at least acknowledgement. The mountains are participating, adding their own wisdom to the compression, guiding her choices in directions that honor connection and memory and the possibility of continued relationship between human consciousness and cosmic intelligence. This is what she learned at the ancestral shrine, that the work isn't just technical, but relational, requiring conversation rather than domination, partnership rather than control. If the mountains are responding, if the citadel itself is participating in the compression, then maybe the window is wider than the entity believes. Maybe relationship creates possibilities that pure computation can't account for. Around her the stones blaze with light that has nothing to do with external sources and everything to do with the archive, revealing its true nature. She's standing in the heart of a cosmic instrument, and every note she plays, every syllable she chants, is a choice about which futures humanity gets to experience and which vanish forever into the void of never were. Security forces regroup below, trying to coordinate a response to something they can't begin to understand. Her family sleeps in the village, unaware that their daughter and sister is reshaping reality on a scale that will determine whether their homes remain standing, whether their language continues, whether their grandchildren will remember what it means to be connected to this place. And Amaya Quispe, tour guide and timeline editor, stands at the Intihuatana stone, with her hands burning and her consciousness spread impossibly wide, making terrible choices with as much care and reverence as she can muster, trusting that consciousness and relationship might be enough to tip cosmic necessity toward the least harmful possible outcome. The ritual is working. Timelines are compressing. Futures are being erased and preserved according to patterns that blend Keshu's calculations, her own values, and the mountain's ancient wisdom. The moment when she might discover whether her own timeline makes the cut, or whether she too will vanish like the children she watched flickering out of existence, erased as if she never mattered at all. The chant reaches its pivotal verse, the moment where the compression parameters can still be adjusted, where her choices will shape not just which timelines survive, but what kind of futures humanity gets to inhabit. And then the vision layers surge around her with force that makes her gasp, splitting reality into configurations so different they might as well be separate universes presenting themselves for judgment. Not unchanged. Nothing survives unchanged, but recognizable. The houses she knows, the families she loves, the children speaking Quechua with her mother's cadence. The terraces are tended by hands that carry generational knowledge. Tourism continues, but in managed balance, quotas enforced, sacred sites protected by indigenous-led cooperatives. Her nephew grows up rooted, becomes a teacher who bridges traditional knowledge and modern education, raises his own children in the valley that's cradled their people for longer than anyone can remember. It's modest, it's local, It's the continuity of small worlds that matter absolutely to the people who inhabit them. And in this configuration, Machu Picchu remains dormant. The archive compressed so severely that it becomes inert, a ruin in truth rather than active cosmic instrument. Its dangers neutralized along with its generative potential. Not destroyed violently, but transformed beyond recognition, or simply faded into memory as populations relocate, as economic forces scatter families, as the language dies with her generation and the connection to place severs. She sees the pain of that loss rippling through individuals who carry displacement like inherited wounds. But she also sees what survives in exchange. Machu Picchu preserved as a living, dangerous archive. A cosmic vault that continues to branch futures, to encode possibilities, to serve as a bridge between human consciousness and intelligence that operates on scales humanity is only beginning to comprehend. In these timelines, the children who grow up aren't hers, but they're someone's. And they inherit a world where contact with cosmic intelligence is acknowledged, where the archive's knowledge becomes accessible to future generations who will face their own impossible choices, where humanity reaches toward distant stars and new sciences and cultural configurations that don't exist yet, but could. The two clusters hang in her perception like opposed magnets, each pulling toward different values, different definitions of what matters and who deserves preservation. Local continuity versus cosmic potential. The survival of her specific community versus the preservation of an instrument that might serve all humanity across timelines she'll never witness. Neither is wrong, neither is right. They're just different configurations of loss and preservation, sacrifice and hope, balanced on opposite sides of a scale that her next verse will tip decisively. She thinks about future generations standing where she's standing now, facing their own versions of this choice, needing access to the archive's wisdom to navigate crises she can't predict. And she thinks about her grandmother's voice, the old stories about sacrifice, the understanding that sometimes you have to choose not what preserves you, but what preserves meaning. Keshu's urgency spikes to desperation, the entity bleeding light and coherence as it waits for her to complete the sequence. Inti's broadcast continues its flickering documentation, catching fragments that will puzzle and haunt viewers without explaining anything. And Amaya stands at the center of everything, the weight of timelines pressing down on her shoulders, knowing that whatever she chooses next will define the rest of her life, and lives she'll never meet. Then she makes her choice, not the one Keshu would choose, which prioritizes system stability above all human attachment. Not the one that simply preserves her village and lets cosmic potential collapse, but something in between, something that requires her to alter the final verses in ways she's never practiced, shaping the sound to do something the entity never explained was possible. Not just timeline compression parameters, but specific patterns, memory patterns, cultural patterns, the precise sonic signatures of her village's streets and voices and rituals. She weaves them into the archive itself as a ring of indelible memory, burning the information so deeply into the substrate that even if the physical place fades in many timelines, even if her people are scattered and the language dies, the memory will persist. Future generations accessing the archive won't just find compressed futures and stability algorithms. They'll find her grandmother's voice, singing in Quechua. They'll find the smell of cooking fires and the sound of children laughing. They'll find the exact configuration of stones in the ancestral shrine and the prayers that were offered there. They'll find proof that her people existed, that they mattered, that their particular way of being in the world was worth remembering even if it couldn't be preserved intact. The memory will survive embedded in the archive itself, accessible to anyone who learns to listen, present in every future timeline as a ring of remembrance that says, these people were here, they loved this place, they made choices with courage, and they deserve to be remembered. The chant becomes not just compression algorithm, but memorial, preservation through memory rather than physical continuity. And as she sings, she feels the village slipping away in timeline after timeline, sees the houses fading, the streets transforming, the physical reality of the place she loves becoming contingent rather than guaranteed. But she also feels the memories solidifying, becoming permanent, woven so deeply into the archive's structure that it becomes part of the cosmic record itself. And the weight of that choice, the adult recognition that sometimes you can't save the thing itself, but you can save the memory of what it meant, threatens to crush her completely. Keeps making the choice that no one should have to make, knowing that this is what guardianship actually requires. Not preservation of every precious thing, but consciousness about what's being sacrificed and absolute commitment that sacrifice will never be rendered meaningless. She feels Keshu's presence flare and vanish, the entity burning out its remaining coherence in the final push to stabilize the compression. She feels the archive lock into its new configuration, timelines pruned and consolidated, the branching structure reduced to manageable complexity, while her village's memory blazes like a permanent star embedded in the substrate. And then darkness swallows her, consciousness unable to sustain the stretch across dimensions, and she falls. When she wakes, dawn is breaking over Machu Picchu. She's still at the Intihuatana, her body cold and stiff, her hands bleeding from gripping the stone too hard for too long. Keshu is gone, not just absent, but erased, its role in reality concluded, whatever remained of its consciousness dissipated into the cosmic background, like smoke. The archive hums with new stability, the fractured regions healed, the cascade points neutralized. She succeeded. The compression worked, and the cost was everything. But conspiracy theories proliferate, grassroots testimonies circulate, and fragments of the footage survive in corners of the internet where people who saw something impossible trade theories and spiritual interpretations. He doesn't get the grand awakening he hoped for. No global consensus shift, no immediate transformation of Peru's international standing. But he gets something. Attention, conversation, space for different stories about what Machu Picchu might be and what indigenous knowledge might offer. It's partial victory, compromise rather than triumph, which is maybe the only kind of win that was ever possible. Not immediately. The transformation takes months, requires healing from physical and psychic damage that nearly killed her, demands that she learn how to carry the weight of what she did without letting it destroy her. But eventually, she returns to guiding, not with the tour companies which want polished scripts and safe narratives. She works independently now, leading smaller groups who seek something deeper than photographs and factual recitation. She brings them to the stones and tells them true things, not everything. Some experiences resist translation, remain private even when technically shareable, but enough. She speaks about timelines and choices and the impossible weight of cosmic responsibility. She shows them the ring of memory she encoded, teaches the ones who can learn how to listen for the archived voices of people who might not exist in their particular timeline, but whose stories matter anyway. Her guiding is infused with quiet authority and an undercurrent of sorrow that makes some visitors uncomfortable and others profoundly moved. She's no longer naive about what guardianship requires, no longer searching for perfect solutions that leave no one hurt. She's accepted that some people, maybe even her, exist in timelines that were preserved while other versions of them vanished. And she carries that knowledge like prayer, a constant awareness that what she experiences is contingent, purchased through sacrifice, built on foundations of erased possibilities. She visits the village often, or what remains of it in the timeline she inhabits. The place is changing, transformation gradual but inexorable. Some families have left for opportunities in cities. The old language is spoken less frequently. Her mother's generation, the last fluent speakers. Tourism pressure continues, and new regulations restrict traditional practices in ways that would have enraged her before she understood how much worse it could be. But it survives. Modestly, imperfectly. Her nephew still lives there, growing up with some connection to place, even if it's thinner than she'd prefer. And in the archive itself, buried deep in the substrate, his other selves exist as permanent memory. The doctor, the teacher, the versions that didn't make the cut but weren't erased without acknowledgement. She places her hands on the stone and feels the archive humming beneath her palms, stable now, compressed into new equilibrium. And sometimes, if she listens carefully, she hears them. The voices she encoded, her grandmother singing, children laughing in Quechua, the memory of her village preserved as a ring in the tree of timelines. They're gone in most physical timelines. But they're present in the archive itself, their memory permanent, their story woven into the cosmic record for anyone who learns to access it. Machu Picchu rests in new equilibrium, still alive, still dangerous, now bound to Amaya's choice as another ring in the tree of timelines, another layer of human decision shaping what remains possible. The archive will demand sacrifice again. Timelines will need pruning, and whoever comes next will have to choose with whatever wisdom and courage they can muster, hoping that consciousness and care might be enough to tip terrible necessity toward the least harmful possible outcome. And Amaya Quispe, guardian of curated futures, keeper of memories that exist across timelines, witness to what was preserved and what was lost, carries that truth down the mountain into the rest of her life. The weight never gets lighter. The guilt never fully resolves. But she's learned to walk with it, to honor both what survived and what vanished, to ensure that sacrifice is never rendered meaningless by denial or forgetting. The archive hums with new stability, and every generation will face its own version of her impossible decision, bound by the same terrible truth, that reality is not infinite, that futures must be chosen, and that the only real violence would be pretending those choices don't matter, or that the cost can be hidden without consequence. And when they ask if what she's saying is true, if the archive really exists, if timelines were actually compressed that night on the solstice, she smiles with the kind of sadness that comes from carrying knowledge too heavy to share fully. And she says, "The mountains remember. If you learn to listen, they'll tell you themselves." The archive pulses beneath the surface, alive and dangerous and infinitely precious, bound to human choices and cosmic necessity in ways that most visitors will never understand. And Amaya Quispe tends it with the reverence it demands, the guardian who chose with clear eyes and carries the weight forever, ensuring that those who were lost are never forgotten, and those who survived understand the cost of their existence. Machu Picchu endures, not as monument but as living instrument, and Amaya has become its voice, translator between worlds, keeper of memories, witness to the terrible beauty of conscious choice in the face of cosmic necessity.